Okay. It does say live stream. I've got our video editor is on here as well, but he's the only one. So we're not truly live streaming.
Good.
So, all right. Um, First of all, thank you very much for your time, Thomas. Should I call you Thomas? Should I call you Professor? What's preferable
No,
for
just Thomas.
you? Okay, great. Great. So if you'd like to start out with giving a little bit of an introduction of background information. I know a little bit about you, but I think we'd love to hear more.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thanks for inviting me to do this interview. I'm Thomas Johnsen. I'm a professor of procurement and supply management at Audencia Business School in France. I'm Danish, and actually now I'm in Copenhagen in connection with the big Academy of Management conference here. I specialize my research and my teaching in procurement management, supply chain management, and in recent years, a lot of my work has really focused on sustainable procurement, sustainable supply chain management, as well as how procurement can contribute to innovation. So that's what I think we'll talk about today.
Excellent. Would you say that you've had to really adjust to a different, I mean, are there a lot of differences in procurement between what you knew from Denmark to teaching in France now?
Well, I've worked in various business schools and universities since I joined academia. So prior to coming to France, I spent many years in the UK, and I've also had the chance to work in various parts of Scandinavia. I also spent 2.5 years at the Politecnico di Milano, but always with a focus on working on procurement and supply chain management. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot of differences between different European countries. So some countries are perhaps historically more leaning towards doing quantitative research, and others are more leaning towards doing qualitative research. And yeah, I mean, there can be particular themes that are more important in some countries than others. I do find that a lot of French companies have mature practices when it comes to the involvement of procurement in innovation, and certainly also French companies are pretty advanced when it comes to sustainable procurement. Of course, if we look at the Nordic countries as well, they're very well regarded for their focus on sustainability, and that also filters into the role of procurement and supply chain management in implementing sustainability.
So it sounds like you do keep pretty well informed about what's really going on in the space and not just looking at the education space and the theory space, but what's actually happening in companies. Can you tell us about how you do that?
Well, I derive a lot of my knowledge as an academic from my research with companies. And having mentioned about the differences between quantitative and qualitative research, I have always tended to do more qualitative research. One of the reasons for that is that it allows researchers like me to really go into companies and speak to them, interview them on a particular subject, but with a relatively open mind to really trying to get a rich, in-depth understanding of what's really going on. And for example, in researching issues around procurement and supply chains, one of the things I've always tried to do as a research is to make sure that I interview as part of my research, not just people in procurement function, but also people in other functions that procurement are working with. So, for example, in relation to my work on procurement involvement in innovation, I like to also speak to people in R&D, for example, or engineering, or marketing, manufacturing, and so forth. And then also to go and speak to the suppliers, because, of course, if you're looking at how procurement can facilitate innovation with suppliers, it's really about nurturing relationships with suppliers, to develop partnerships with suppliers, to ensure their involvement and their contribution to innovation projects, both in terms of existing suppliers, but also increasingly looking at scouting for new suppliers, which is really one of the main themes of my research in recent years. So to go and be able to speak to suppliers to hear from their side, what do they feel about the buying company's ability to involve them in innovation projects, for example. I've always found that fascinating, and to be able to work with companies from different industries and this as well, to really get an understanding, not just, to be an expert in a single one industry. I've always tried to develop insights into many different industries to try to understand what's going on. And that includes not just private sector, but also, for example, public sector organizations that also have obvious need to focus on procurement practices and even procurement involvement in innovation, as well as, of course, sustainable procurement and manufacturing, as well as service industries as well.
Within that, you mentioned that one of your topics of research is innovation within the space. What inspired you, or what did you learn that made you shift your focus of procurement of being a cost-driven space to innovation-driven?
Well, I would say, first of all, I don't think it's an either-or question, because procurement will always have a key contribution around making cost savings. But as we're looking at procurement becoming more mature, more strategic in many companies, it's also a key contribution for procurement to be able to contribute to innovation. So if I can put a little bit of context on this, first of all, and why do we look at innovation and why is innovation a subject for procurement? Because obviously, traditionally, innovation is not something where you think, well, yeah, that's procurement's job. It is not, obviously. But if we look at innovation these days, I think we have to understand it in the sense of, or in the context of the transition that the world is undergoing currently, the green transition, which implies discontinuing old technological paradigms, if you like, such as the most obvious example here is probably the automotive industry that has relied on fossil fuels to make internal combustion engines, of course, as well as other industries that have also relied on fossil fuels to transition towards new technologies, whether it's electrification or the possibility of shifting towards hydrogen power or whatever. Yeah, these kinds of developments really require a whole different level of innovation from what many industries have been used to in the past. In the past, it was very much about continuous improvement, incremental innovation, but these days it's really much more about making these kind of disruptive innovations or discontinuous innovations, breaking with the past technological paradigms, to use that expression again. And that might be completely new business models, changing also from, say, linear supply chains towards circular or what we might call closed loop supply chains. And again, all the technological innovations that are required to do that. Now, this implies new supply chains, new supply models, and therefore it also implies that there is a need to develop new relationships with suppliers, to scout for new suppliers that can develop fundamentally different technology that maybe didn't exist traditionally within an industry. So we talk a lot about, for example, not just sourcing, but scouting for innovations in wider ecosystems. And of course, when we're talking about sourcing activities and so on, that's procurement. Again, if we think about something like the automotive industry as an example, these transitions also come with a lot of supply risks. So one traditional job for procurement, of course, has also been to manage supply risks, to make sure that the company doesn't end up in a supply bottleneck situation. Very well-known problem. And of course, a lot of these transitions that we're seeing, innovations across different industries these days, actually require the use of technologies. If we think about battery technology that requires very rare materials, including what we call conflict minerals and so forth. So there's a lot of supply chain challenges in a lot of innovations for companies these days. So for me, the involvement of procurement is really important. And therefore, from my point of view as well, as a researcher, as a teacher, this is really interesting to study as well, to try to understand really what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Starting from the basics, as a teacher, how would you recommend these procurement teams to kind of shift the mindset into embracing innovation?
Well, I think it's, as you're saying here, there is a need to change mindset, to shift away from the traditional understanding as procurement is the function whose main remit is to make cost savings, to a function that also should contribute to innovation. So that really links in with procurement being perceived by management, being perceived by other functions in companies, and I mentioned already R&D, I think that's a critical one when we're talking about innovation, but procurement becoming perceived as a function that actually has something to contribute to innovation. I did some work with one company, it's a Nordic company, where there was exactly this kind of friction between the procurement function and the R&D function, where procurement was wanting to make contributions to a specific innovation project or a new product introduction project, and R&D realized that they needed their capabilities in order to source new technology. But a lot of the people in the R&D department really was not convinced at all that procurement could understand the language of R&D and that they wouldn't simply slow down a lot of the R&D processes. And of course, it's only really through learning to work together across functions that people can realize that. Of course, it's also then a question of the people working in procurement actually being equipped, having the capabilities to make those contributions. It's one thing that they think that they could make contributions, but they need, of course, the capabilities, the competencies to do so as well.
So on that line of thought, when should procurement be invited in to work with R&D on a new product or service development? Is there a right time?
Well, the earlier the better in general. So we've talked for a long time about this concept of early supplier involvement on the basis that when a company is developing a new product, then it makes sense to involve key suppliers during concept development, typically, in order for those suppliers to be able to influence the design, to be able to make contributions on what are the supply issues, because the suppliers are inevitably going to end up manufacturing those parts. So when we talk about procurement involvement, we then also talk about early procurement involvement, just the way we would talk about early supplier involvement. So, during concept development is certainly what we would like to see, and I think that's about the right time. If we're looking at much later involvement than concept development, it becomes much more difficult for procurement to influence decisions. If all the once the specifications for a new product, for example, being developed, once specifications are already decided by R&D or by engineering, and they then invite procurement to try to suggest, all right, so do you know any suppliers that can actually produce this for us? Well, that could well be too late, and therefore it makes sense for procurement to become involved, certainly during concept development. It's potentially also, we talk about the stage before concept development sometimes as idea generation or ideation, as we might call it, the sort of fuzzy stage of innovation where it's all abstract discussions about an idea, and companies can also do feasibility studies, for example, at the early stage to look at, might we develop a completely new, different type of car or smartphone or piece of furniture or whatever it is. And so at that very early stage, of course, it's really before there's any kind of concrete discussions. But procurement, I think, increasingly actually needs to be involved at that very early stage, not only within individual companies, but industry level as well. So we have a lot of industries that are really at industry level engaging in exploring the opportunities for moving in a particular technological direction. Again, think about hydrogen power, for example, or electrification in the automotive industry. So whether these are feasible options, what are, again, the supply issues and so on. I think procurement really should be involved in those types of discussions as well.
Another thing that kind of goes with how procurement works within the company, you had also mentioned you think that procurement being a cost driver as well as innovation driven, it makes sense that finance would be very heavily involved in this. So where do we see the biggest clashes between finance and procurement in terms of innovation initiatives?
Well, finance, and I must say, I think it's a really good question. But I don't think there's been an awful lot of research into that finance
Sure.
procurement link for innovation. But traditionally, finance, of course, will look at the cost side of things. I think has a perception of procurement as being the cost saving function rather than a function whose role it should be to contribute to innovation as well. So I think it's going back to that question about the mindset from earlier as well, that it's a question of how do finance departments look at procurement and will they accept that procurement actually could make contributions to innovations. And I think then it's for procurement to persuade the finance colleagues that they can make contributions, to point out, for example, innovations critically important for the company and will inevitably involve issues to do with supply risks. They know about that. They know about supply markets, and therefore they must be involved. So I think there certainly are potential clashes there, as you're saying. We would like to see, of course, finance and procurement people really working in collaboration together rather than in conflict.
So that could potentially be an internal barrier. Are there other potential barriers, whether it's structural or cultural, that could hold procurement back from innovating?
Well, I think I've mentioned already a little bit about the competencies of procurement people. So I've been involved in various projects on procurement competencies. There was one project with various European partners, an Erasmus Plus funded project I was involved in fairly recently, where we looked at new procurement competencies for innovation and sustainability. So we identified really a need for what we call holistic procurement competencies. And that's, as holistic implies, it's really about procurement people being able to see the big picture, to see its contribution internally within companies beyond the boundaries of just the procurement function, to look at, what kind of cross-functional issues are there, how can procurement make a contribution not just to cost reduction, but to revenue improvement as well as looking at external relationships, to look at supply chains, but also, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of ecosystem. So I don't like to talk so much about supply chains these days. Really, I'd like to talk about supply networks and ecosystems. So I think from a procurement competence point of view, it's also really about people understanding that global context that they work within, both within their organizations and outside their organizations, and the various contributions that they can make. You mentioned about structural constraints as well. So what we see with some companies is also that they reorganize their procurement functions because they have a need not just for operational procurement, but also what we might call innovation procurement. So we see examples in some companies where they are actually creating new procurement teams or functions to really work as a kind of bridge or boundary spanner, if you like, between procurement and R&D in particular, and other internal functions, as well as boundary spanner or bridging role externally, principally towards suppliers, of course. I think inevitably as well, in terms of talk about constraints, we should also acknowledge that, of course, it's about KPIs, because how procurement is being measured both at the departmental level but also at individual buyer level has a hugely important role on how people behave, what are the kind of projects that they will work hardest on. Well, unless there's a KPI for something as a motivating factor, it can be difficult to get people to dedicate their time to work on those kind of projects.
I want to go back to before you mentioned, obviously, procurement, one of the roles is to avoid risk within a company. But obviously, that can be a bit of a holdback when we talk about innovation. So, how would you recommend procurement professionals can overcome some of that risk aversion to really focus on innovation?
Very good question. And I mentioned as well briefly at the beginning of our talk here that I also do a little bit of work with public sector procurement. And public sector management, including public procurement, is very often characterized as well by this sort of risk aversion, because people working in public sector don't want to be exposed for any kind of decision to adopt a new innovative technology. For example, if we think about healthcare sector, they want to make sure that anything that's that they adopt and end up buying is one that doesn't come with unnecessary risks. And of course, it means that it can be very difficult to introduce new innovations because innovation implies risks, whichever sector that you're working within. So I think it's there's a need really for a realization that it's okay to take risks. It's okay to fail as well, because a large proportion of innovation projects will not come to fruition. And therefore, it's, I think, reassuring procurement functions that they need to make contributions to innovations. But if it fails, then it's about learning from what went wrong and moving on, rather than being on the receiving end of the blame and your job is in danger and so on. I think it's, that's really part of developing a healthy innovation culture, to encourage people to take those risks and create an environment, an atmosphere in which it's encouraged to contribute to innovation. And of course, it also ultimately comes down to competence development, to training and education as well, to prepare people to do this.
You were mentioning you don't talk about supply chains, but supply networks. And obviously, suppliers, they have a huge impact on how innovative we can be within any industry. What signals should procurement look for? What can they do to identify good suppliers, innovative suppliers, ones that they can work with together to create real change?
I think it's about how can a company identify innovative capabilities in a supplier. How can they, as part of the supplier selection and onboarding process, what are the kind of innovative capabilities? How can they measure these? So when we think about how we measure innovation, we typically look at things like patents. So, what kind of patents does this supplier own, or it could also be, of course, the kind of people that they employ. What kind of R&D budget do they have? So do they invest a lot in R&D, for example? What kind of relationships with other companies does a supplier have? And, it's all about who are you connected to as well? Are you connected with other innovative partners as part of an innovation ecosystem, effectively? So for a company, it's really about being able to tap into suppliers like that, and from a research point of view as well, and this reflects practice, of course. One of the big things that we see is tapping into startups as well, much more so than in the past. It's now necessary for a lot of companies that really need to innovate to try to connect with startup companies. And of course, startup companies are completely different from your sort of standard supplier, and therefore there are particular challenges involved in connecting with these suppliers to try to convert them into a future supplier. You talk about signaling as well. That's also making me think about this idea of the weak signals, because when we're looking at scouting for innovation, it becomes a question also of picking up weak signals. What I mean by that is that companies have traditionally gone to their long-term supply partners when they have sought to involve suppliers in a new product development project, for example, or product introduction project. Because they have developed a lot of trust with those suppliers over time. They know exactly what they do, the technologies, the capabilities they have, and so forth. But increasingly, and I'm emphasizing this theme again, increasingly is really about tapping into suppliers that are potentially from outside of a company's existing supply chains, potentially from a completely different industry. It's really in a much wider ecosystem, and therefore the company needs to try to pick up on these sort of weak signals to look at potential new suppliers that may or may not have any potential as contributors to innovation, but it really becomes this sort of much more exploratory exercise and scouting for these potential new partners, including startups, for example.
How would you recommend procurement teams go about scouting for those new suppliers, especially in terms of startups? Where do they find them? How do they connect with them?
Very interesting question. So for companies that are trying to tap into, to connect with these kind of new suppliers, I think it really requires engagement in a lot of sort of industry level activity. We see some companies that are very good at running innovation days or workshops, and of course can also do traditional things like attending trade fairs and so forth. But yeah, to really try to engage in these kind of industry level activities. We see also companies that are good at creating these sort of incubators for startups, to try to identify startups that may be at an early stage or later stage of development, and really try to help them in their tradition to finally become a supplier that can produce and start to deliver products or services or technologies. So we see companies that, for example, have these kind of accelerator programs as well, to again try to engage in a startup ecosystem, to try to help them to survive and to thrive and eventually become their supplier.
Refocusing back on the procurement team itself, what capabilities and skills matter most when it comes to making that innovation? Is it what kind of analytical or relational or strategic skills do they need?
Well, I mentioned earlier this notion of holistic procurement competencies, seeing the big picture. So this also implies that competencies like relationship development, relationship management, being able to persuade, going back to the example of R&D and the relationship between procurement and R&D, but also with top management or with finance, for example, to persuasive skills, team building, collaborative skills and so on. These are, of course, traditional procurement skills, but are really becoming ever more important. And I would say also skills, and this is coming from the research that I've done with my colleagues as well, that skills like curiosity. You've got to have a natural sense of curiosity in order to appreciate that this could be an interesting innovation. Yeah, we should explore that. I want to try to understand more about this and what is the potential of that. And I wouldn't say necessarily that kind of curiosity is a traditional procurement competence. Critical thinking is another one that springs to mind as well. So, of course, not just being curious and excited about new potential technology, but being able to think critically about, well, is it going to work? What are the issues involved? And then I would say also procurement's role traditionally, in addition to focusing on cost savings, is of course also about the whole commercial side of relationships with suppliers. So making to ensure that the proper evaluation and approval onboarding routes are respected, contracting skills and so forth. So I think these are also critically important skills for and competencies for procurement to be able to contribute to innovation.
So you mentioned that curiosity is maybe more innate, but is there a way that these skills could be built or acquired by the teams that are already working together?
Well, I think for procurement functions to mature effectively implies developing people's competencies, and that of course can be done through internal training. It plays in many different ways, of course. One of the things that I have seen that has impressed me a lot is where I see companies that are doing training, but where they actually involve procurement people together with their colleagues from other functions as well, so that they get a chance to discuss. It's all very well if I, for example, has been involved in some training with procurement in a company, then it's all very well for these people to sit and talk together about, we should be contributing to innovation or whatever. But unless, again, their colleagues from other functions are there, and unless the management people are there as well to also engage as part of that process, it doesn't really get them very far. So the training and development, and of course, recruitment as well. You need maybe to recruit new people and to supplement the existing procurement profiles with some new profiles. One of the things that has impressed me is that we see various French companies that, for example, have gone out to recruit innovation buyers, whose job really is to play that role, to focus specifically on buying new innovations.
So this comes up a lot, obviously, especially when we talk about adding new roles to the team, and especially if you want an innovation buyer. How can the procurement team manage some of the internal politics, specifically maybe with leadership when it comes to championing these new innovation initiatives?
It's a difficult question, that one, because of course, whenever you're trying to make change in an organization, there can also be politics involved. If you're trying to make people do different things from what they're used to, it can rub people up the wrong way. Some people will be unhappy with these kind of organizational change processes, and that's both within your own teams, but also in the relations with other teams. So there can be some conflict and some friction there as well. So yeah, I mean, again, I would point to uh, training, a lot of activities that you can do towards training, towards team building and so forth, to try to develop an understanding of what are the challenges for the organization, why we're doing these, why are we having to make changes, so forth.
Yeah. When it comes to pushing these new ideas, are there specific ethical or transparency concerns that are arising? And if so, how do we deal with those?
Good question, difficult question. I would say I think there will always be potential ethical or transparency concerns when you're dealing with innovation as well. You need to make sure that decisions are taken that are within the ethical boundaries of the companies, and there could be, I would say, maybe more so than ethics. I would say very often it's a question of legitimacy as well. About, is it legitimate that we go down this route? Yeah, that we develop an innovation that completely changes the nature of what we do, maybe changes the business model, our reputation in the marketplace, and so forth, as well as legitimacy internally within a company as well. So again, thinking about procurement, do they have that legitimacy to make contributions to innovation? Thinking about transparency here as well. I do think that we talk a lot about, of course, the importance of supply chain transparency when we think about sustainable supply chain, sustainable procurement. It's really all about developing transparency in the supply chain as well. And I think when we're innovating as well, we've got to be open about decisions. We've got to be open. We've got to have a climate of openness and honesty.
Yeah. True. I want to talk about something you've done. You've done lots of things, as we discussed. But you obviously have come across a lot of various themes in all of your research, and you've also been editing for the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management over 16 years now, I believe. So when it came to writing your book, why was it that sustainable procurement was the topic you chose?
Yeah, well, and thank you for mentioning the Journal of Purchasing Management. I've been very loyal to that for a number of years. I wasn't sure, 16 years actually, but it possibly is. So yeah, my book is Sustainable Procurement and Supply Chain Management. This is the third edition of the book that I'm currently working on, and it's with three other colleagues, Joe Miemczyk and Mickey Howard and Leonardo Marquez. And we launched the first edition of the book over 10 years ago now. The second edition of the book was just before COVID. So that's also encouraging us to work on this third edition of the book, because so many things have obviously happened since the COVID crisis when it comes to procurement and supply chains. But the idea of focusing on sustainability really right from the beginning, from when we decided to write the first book, was that sustainable procurement was being treated as a side subject. It was being, very often when we looked at existing textbooks for purchasing / procurement and supply chain management 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they would have a chapter at the very end which was about sustainability issues. So all the aspects of procurement were being treated, in all the chapters throughout the book, whether it's about procurement strategy, organizational issues, supplier relationship management, sourcing, etc., etc. And then was just this chapter at the end dealing with sustainability. So our fundamental idea with that book has always been, right from the start, that sustainability is something that has to be considered in all parts of the procurement and supply chain management processes. So this was a fundamental idea, and we have really integrated sustainability concerns into every single chapter in the book. So all the different aspects of procurement, supply chain management that we're dealing with. And again, of course, as a motivation for writing the third edition of the book, hope to finish this autumn with launch soon thereafter. But there are lots of different aspects of procurement that have changed in recent years. So on the regulatory side, not least within Europe, we've had all of this going backwards and forwards about corporate sustainability, due diligence directive, and all of these compliance-driven sustainability regulations and changes, as well as the whole innovation side as well, of course, in addition to just looking at sustainability as a compliance or a risk that has to be managed. It also has huge implications for innovation, as we've talked about here, also for procurement. So yeah, it's always hard work to work on a book, but it's a very satisfying project as well.
Definitely have a busy summer ahead of you then, I guess. Yeah. So would you say that these sustainability goals stimulate innovation? Are they the biggest driver right now that we see? Is it the only driver?
Well, certainly, again, going right back to the beginning of our conversation here, yeah, so I mentioned about the whole green transitioning really requires companies across all industries to innovate. When companies need to make, and I would say, it's not only about the environmental sustainability, but also all of the social sustainability requires technological disruption. And again, I made this reference to changing technological paradigms. Of course, it also requires changing supply chain models, so supply chain innovation from linear to circular again. And yeah, we shouldn't forget also about the potential of new digital technologies, something I hadn't really talked a lot about, but when we think about innovation, of course, it's also about new AI or blockchain technology that can transform the way in which supply chains work, including things like enabling supply chain transparency, also on the sustainability side. So, we see more and more digital platforms that are developed, AI-enabled, blockchain, for example, I mentioned here again, as two important technology developments that are also enabling companies to improve their management of development of sustainable supply chains, sustainable sourcing, as well as things like scouting for new technology, something that I didn't mention earlier, but we see, for example, service providers, procurement service providers that have developed in recent years that are helping companies with AI-enabled scouting technology to help them in their scouting efforts.
Last question I've got for you. How do you see procurement redefining its role in organizations within the next 5 years?
Interesting question. So I think that procurement will become even more strategic than it is now. And I think the pressure towards sustainable supply chain development, the importance of innovation in that connection as well that we've talked about here, are really pushing procurement to the forefront of companies. But it means that procurement has to mature, and I think it has to change in many ways as well. And one of the ways I think we can see procurement doing that is to really become this kind of innovation hub or knowledge hub in organizations where it's seen as a kind of go-to function for innovation. So, when a company realizes that it needs to work towards a particular innovation project, then it will actually go to procurement in order to try to understand, who do we need to speak to? Who do we need to connect to? What are the potential partnerships that need to be developed? I think procurement will become more strategic. I think procurement will therefore also need to change in order to do so. I think we'll see procurement becoming also what we might call ambidextrous. One of the things I've worked on with various colleagues in research is to look at this kind of double role of procurement. Again, back to the beginning here, you were talking about procurement's role as cost-focused traditionally, and then the innovation-focused role as well. So I think I said, it's not an either or, but it's a both and that is this idea of ambidexterity, where procurement functions actually need to be able to not forget about its origins in delivering cost savings and contributing also to supply risk management, but also to make contributions to innovation as well. So I think this idea of ambidexterity and being this kind of the hub, it's this kind of octopus function, which is important.
Is there anything else you'd like to shout out here at the end?
No, I think that's all for now. So thank you for your time here to interview.
Thank you so much. I definitely feel like I've learned something. I think our viewers will too.